Nonprofits are the third leg of the community stool, along with government and business, that ensure that your communities are viable places for everybody. Your work matters so very much. So the most important thing I want to say to you today is thank you. But then I'm going to say, what on earth have you gotten yourself into? So in order to carry out the legal responsibilities that Will has talked about and to steward your organization and its resources well, and to remain trusted by the people you serve, the donors, your community, there are certain best practices you need to follow. Lots of people come onto boards not sure what these are, and I hope our presentations can help you get oriented. Before I start my laundry list, I want to point out that boards have different functions depending on the maturity of the organization. There will always be programs and governance to address, no matter the size or maturity of the group, but the proportion of time you're going to spend on these might change. An all-volunteer board might expect to be directly involved in programs like packing food boxes, or administration like stuffing envelopes 80% of the time, and maybe governance, making sure that required documents are adopted and filed, that laws are adhered to, and that infrastructure for the future is being built about 20% of the time. And your plan will likely be a very action-oriented one-year work plan, but it still needs to be written down, by the way. As organizations mature, these proportions change. So when the organization is at its peak of maturity, board members might expect to spend 90% or more of their time on governance, and program responsibilities might mean showing up at events. Your plan is going to be a strategic plan now that forecasts your evolution, your activities, and your budget needs for the next 3 to 5 years, as much as anybody can forecast for 3 to 5 years in this crazy environment right now. So the first thing I'd say is learn where your nonprofit is on its journey. This will help you know if your role is primarily a governance one or a programmatic one. Even if it's programmatic, it doesn't mean you can ignore governance. And if your organization is in one of those very delicate places where it's changing from a program-oriented board to a governance-oriented board, your nominating committee may be the most important committee this year, for it'll be identifying the people and the skills that they need to become successful in your next phase of life. So I hope you listen to these remarks and my list with this in mind. If you're with an all-volunteer organization, you definitely need to know your legal role, but don't tune out when I say executive director or mention details of governance just because you're not there yet. Part of your job as stewards of your organization's mission and future will be about laying the foundation for an effective infrastructure now, so that as you transition, the basics are in place. For example, your work plan might say, by the end of 2021, we're going to have adopted these 5 policies. By June 2022, you're going to have adopted these 5 policies. By December of 2022, we'll have the funds for a part-time staff, like that. So best definition of a board that I've seen is this one. Boards are stewards who steer the organization towards a sustainable future by adopting sound ethical, legal, governance, and financial policies, and by making sure the nonprofit has the resources, money, people, time, reputation, connections to advance its mission. Lots of governance junkies come up with cute mantras for a board, like the well-known 3 W's, which I suspect a lot of you have heard. A board member should expect to bring work and/or wealth and/or wisdom to a board. But I'm no different. I've worked for the state for many years, so I love acronyms and things like that. I have created, drum roll please, Maryo's 6 A's of being a great board member. Please don't be discouraged if your nonprofit may not now have all the policies and procedures I'm going to mention, but you can help your nonprofit gradually acquire them as your group matures. Let's talk attitude. You should have a passion for the mission, vision, and values of the organization and the good and the potential good it can do. Kind of foundational, right? You need to have a lot of times people don't think about this so much when they jump on a board. You need to have a willingness to learn about the ecosystem, whether it's food security or mental health, and the unique niche that your nonprofit fills in that ecosystem. Maybe there's another group in the food security sandbox that feeds toddlers better than you do. Great, support them like crazy. Don't duplicate what they do, and meet occasionally as an ecosystem to make sure that there aren't people being double served and others who are not being served at all. 2022 is not the time to be territorial. You need, as Will said, a willingness to invest time and to work. You need a willingness to embrace your role as a board member. You need a willingness to understand the delicate balancing acts among staff and board roles, the spirit and the letter of the law, and letting that consciousness guide you in navigating the many very gray areas that is reality.
Maryo, sorry to interrupt.
Sure.
I think we all appreciate really seeing your face through this presentation, but if you do have slides, I don't believe your screen is shared yet. So if you want to put those up.
Okay. Thank you for letting me know.
Of course.
And I had clicked share screen. So are we there?
Great.
Thank you. Okay, attitude. We talked about that. So what do you actually do? First of all, before you start, before your first meeting, explore the website, obtain and read the job description for board members. And if there isn't one, make it a personal goal to ensure that job descriptions are adopted this year. Read the most recent annual report, the minutes of the last 2 previous meetings, and then at least skim the bylaws, the strategic plan, the budget, the most recent balance sheet, and the most recent budget to actual. Also, before or at the start of your term, you should expect to sign a conflict of interest document and a confidentiality policy document. Some boards ask you to sign the board job description document as well. And start looking at your policies right now, whether they're in a policy book, a special place online, or in a single massive document that covers everything. There are good governance and ethics practices that donors and funders want to see, and which let those whom you serve in your community be confident that you're ethical, efficient, and effective. So during your time in office, you should plan to attend meetings, as Will said, and schedule your calendar around these meetings. Some boards require service on a committee. Attend these meetings regularly too. Read in advance the board meeting materials. Come prepared to the meetings. Participate in meetings. Ask for clarification. Raise concerns. Contribute ideas. If there aren't certain policies in place, speak up. Review the finances. Don't assume that finances are just the bailiwick of the treasurer or the finance committee. Just because they've got financial background, they can take care of it. That's not true. When it comes to finance, there are no bad questions. Be unafraid to ask. You approve the job description of the executive director, his or her salary and benefits. You hire that person. You ensure there's a regular evaluation for that person. You approve the raises for that person, and if necessary, if you have to, fire that person if laws are broken, policies violated, or the director fails to execute their job description or to address concerns raised in the evaluation process. You need to participate in planning. You aren't only responsible for the today, but you're also responsible for ensuring the tomorrow, that the organization is evolving and vital as you leave the board and now pass the organization on to your successor. You need to ensure that there's a policy book. Policy documents are a series of policy documents, and tomorrow we'll be sending you a couple samples of the policies you should have. The policies should be reviewed regularly and affirmed, revised, or added to. For example, these days, good governance says that the non-discrimination policy, which I suspect all of you have, is not only about race, gender, disability, creed, and age, but also gender identity, and many nonprofits simply don't have that. Similarly, these days, it's almost mandatory for a nonprofit to have a statement about equity and inclusion. When our community foundation reviews the fiscal policies document that we require you to submit with your grant application, if the date the policies were adopted or affirmed isn't recent, the applicant's management score, and thus perhaps the amount of grant, will be affected. Finally, learn things about your field and about nonprofit governance, because both of them are evolving right now, maybe every day. Perhaps each board member could be responsible for reading one book, attending one webinar, researching one topic, and summarizing what you've learned for your colleagues. My next A, develop and conserve your assets. And of course, we all think of money first, which is big. So you're going to want to donate an amount that's significant to you. Whatever your financial situation, significant is going to mean something different. That's a good thing. But donate something significant to you. This is part of your fundraising role too, because prospective grantors want to know that 100% of your board has donated to the organization. Otherwise, the subtext is, well, geez, if the board doesn't care enough to donate, why should I? You're going to want to participate in funding. A lot of board members freeze up at this one, but there are a lot of ways to do this. Writing notes on the annual appeal letter or making thank you calls, because data shows that personal touches matter. You can open your beautiful home for an intimate fundraising event, or identify people who could be donors but now aren't. Take your pals out to breakfast and tell them compelling stories about the good your organization does. Set them up for a later ask by somebody. You can accompany the executive director or the development director on a fundraising visit, or of course, make the ask yourself. And finally, reviewing financials and your budget to make sure that planning and spending are prudent. Now, we don't often think, although we need to, that people are our most important process, people are product, asset. So let's talk about developing and conserving our people. If you're the president, don't micromanage the executive director. This is one of the main reasons that executive directors resign. If you aren't the president, remember that the president is the point of contact between board and executive director, unless the president has specifically empowered you to do something. Oh, and don't serve as the shoulder for another employee to cry on. This undermines your executive director and your president both. You want to ensure there's a personnel manual that not only lays out basic procedures, but acknowledges the well-being of your employees, adequate vacation time, personal time off, maybe even mental health days that are separate from PTO. You want to do your best to make sure that your staff is paid as well as possible and see what benefits you can provide. There's this terrible sort of nonprofit trap that's easy to fall into, saying, how little can we pay an executive director? That's the wrong question. Instead, what you want to do is say, what do we need in order to ensure that our great staff members stay with the organization and cherish working here? You're going to want to make sure that the staff structure is the best one for getting the job done according to the plan you've adopted. Structures change as organizations evolve. You're going to want to make sure that job descriptions exist and are realistic for the staff, including performance goals, but the only staff person you as the board evaluate is the executive director. And finally, you're going to want to make sure there's a written job description for board members, committees, and officers as well, that includes what they're expected to do, the scope of their work, and whom they're accountable to. And finally, a huge asset that we need to conserve and develop that we often don't think of is time, maybe the most precious commodity that we've got in 2021. You don't want to adopt a plan that's unrealistic. If you've got deliverables in your plan, it's going to require your staff to constantly work on weekends and ignore their families. If you've got fundraising goals that simply can't be met, you're setting your organization up for failure as your staff burns out because they want to do their best, and the quality of their work might erode. Thoughtfully recognizing the time a plan is going to take to execute is vital. And if that big plan has to be done without dropping any of the current things, then it's your responsibility to find the funds to hire the staff or the contract personnel to carry it out. Make sure the staff has what they need to be effective and efficient, the right structure, software, equipment, space. And don't waste time with unnecessary meetings or meetings that ramble or are inefficient. That's a great way to dishonor your people. Serving as ambassador is vital. It's another role of yours. But whenever you're in the community, remember you wear a board hat, represent your organization positively and with warmth and excitement. Talk up the great things you do. The better your nonprofit's reputation, the more receptive donors, government, other community organizations, and prospective new board members are going to be. And what's said in the meetings stays in the meetings. You may disagree with something, or you may vote in the minority on something, but don't express a contrary view publicly. Be appropriate. The board sets policy. The director is responsible for carrying out. Sounds nice and clean. It isn't, of course, but micromanaging how the executive director carries out your policy is outside the scope of your role, unless in a board meeting or privately, the director seeks your advice. It's important to remember which hat you're wearing and take off and put on those hats accordingly. Sometimes you're a governor, sometimes you're a collaborator, sometimes you're a volunteer. When you're in a board meeting, you're a governor, but not outside of the board meetings. When you're in a board meeting, you're a governor. A governor is an organizational steward. It doesn't make you the director's direct boss. That's the president's job. If you're on a committee or committee chair, you're really more of a collaborator with your executive director or staff. And if you come to the office to stuff envelopes or pack food bags, you're just a volunteer like any other volunteer and subordinate to the staff person or other volunteer who's in charge. Hooray, the last A. So you're going to be the assessor. Constant assessment is your job too. Do you know where your nonprofit is in its life cycle and what that implies? Is your nonprofit playing well in the sandbox that's your particular ecosystem, complementing, avoiding duplication, supporting, coordinating, even collaborating with other groups? Does your nonprofit express the impact it wants to make and track in a systematic way whether it's making that impact? Does the president or perhaps the executive or personnel committee evaluate the executive director annually? And does the board review and approve that evaluation? Does the board have a process by which it assesses its own performance every year? There's lots of samples of that available. And finally, does the board have a process by which concerns that might surface during the self-assessment can be addressed? The self-assessment represents a great time to see if your life cycle is evolving, what skill sets the next board needs to have, because not only are you asking, is the bus headed in the right direction, but also, are the right people on the bus to get it there?